hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Study Sessions. My name is Mr. Boff, and I'm an English teacher at St George's School in Blackpool. Now, when I started this podcast, the primary focus was Key Stage 4, particularly our Year 10 students sitting their literature exam. However, we thought it'd be a great idea to branch out and to provide podcast episodes that help Year 7, 8, and 9 students at St George's in their forthcoming end-of-year assessments. It's tricky to revise, particularly at Key Stage 3, when this is perhaps a new process, and many of the students in Year 10 found this a useful way of revising. It gave them some new ideas, it gave them some new things to be thinking about. So in today's episode, this is primarily for our Year 9 students. In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at Wilfred Owen's famous poem, famous critique of war, the horrors of war in many ways, the famous poem Dulce et Decorum Est. And so what I'll do is very similar to previous episodes. I'm going to read the poem in its entirety, and then there'll be a second, much longer section where I'll go through the poem in detail, but also perhaps draw your attention to a couple of things about the poem that maybe you've not thought about or considered. Now, much of this episode is, in fact, indebted to a particular piece of writing, a particular academic text by Stephen Benz from the University of Mexico. This is almost entirely based on his essay, The Poet as Rhetor, a reading of Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. Now, that word at the end there, that you might not have heard, rhetor, I had to actually look up. I knew it'd be something to do with rhetoric because of the look of the word, and it means an orator, or one who is skilled in the use of rhetoric. And that gives you some indication of the focus of this episode, really. I want to look at Dulce et Decorum Est rhetorically, because it is a poem that does have a clear rhetorical thrust, a clear rhetorical approach, and that's maybe something that we don't always think about. So most of the episode will focus on that. It will obviously link into your knowledge and your study of the Aristotelian triad, but I also want to draw your attention to just how judicious and skillful and apt Wilfred Owen's choices of vocabulary are. Now, when we talk about vocabulary choices or language choices, we're talking specifically, if we want to be a bit more formal about it, we're talking about diction. So the episode's also going to be looking at Owen's diction and use of language in the poem, and perhaps some choices that are surprising, unusual, and that's what gives this poem its power and its sense of originality too. So I'm going to read the poem out now in its entirety, and then we'll move on to the analytical discussion. Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil's, sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. So we've just heard the poem in full, and in this section of the episode, I'm going to work through the poem stanza by stanza, but thinking about the poem in relation to rhetoric and even more specifically, the Aristotelian triad. And that's because this is a poem that I think has a rhetorical purpose. It has a persuasive purpose. In this poem, and the poem is doing lots of different things, but in this poem, Owen is seeking to persuade the reader of the horrors of World War One, definitely, perhaps the horrors of war more generally, but also seeking to persuade us to change our mind, perhaps, around, as the title attests and makes clear in the very final couple of lines of the poem, that Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori is, as Owen himself writes, the old lie. So if that's the at least one of the purposes of the poem is to persuade us to change our views, to adopt, Owen's view potentially around the horrors, certainly of trench warfare, industrialized warfare in World War One, it is actually worth looking at this poem in relation to rhetoric and, as I said, more specifically, the Aristotelian triad. So we're talking about pathos, the appeal to emotion. We're talking about logos, appeals to reason and rationality, but also the careful logical structuring of the poem. And then finally, ethos, credibility. Why should we take Owen seriously on this particular topic? Why is he credible and trustworthy? So if we look at that opening image of the soldiers bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags. We've got beggars and hags. The soldiers are variously in the first two lines compared first to beggars and then to hags. And this is the sense that war is unmanning. We've got the debilitating effect of war, not just sort of physically, the language of sickness, coughing like hags, the fact that they're bent double, but later we'll see clearly the psychological impact of war, the idea that they are drunk with fatigue. So yes, in this opening stanza, we've got the debilitating, severe debilitating effects of war physically, but also that extends beyond the physical into the psychological. At the same time, talking about credibility and ethos, we're also then thinking about the idea that Owen is basing this poem on his own direct lived experiences. And despite the really unpleasant description of the soldiers, beggars, hags, the speaker of the poem, that we might in some ways see as, obviously Owen himself, the use of the collective pronoun we links into that credibility. It also is an expression of solidarity. The speaker of the poem is, one of the beggars, one of the hags, and there is that sense of solidarity. So yes, he does say it's a lie that it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country, but that doesn't mean that Owen turns his back on the soldiers. He is one of them. We, the collective pronoun, I think connects very clearly to ethos. One of the things that makes this poem very powerful in an emotional sense is Owen's remarkable control of diction, and by that I mean particular vocabulary choices. And we see something like that even in the choice of the word sludge, that second line, we cursed through sludge. Note, it's not mud. Owen could have chosen mud. Now, obviously, there's the practical reason that the rhyme scheme employed here means that he needs something potentially to rhyme with trudge. But also, I think, much more interestingly, sludge has, if you look the word up in the OED, Oxford English Dictionary entry, the word sludge conveys the horrible kind of mixture of different materials, sort of poisons, waste material, and so on. And that's precisely what we're talking about here. Mud, far too straightforward, far too closely linked to the sort of natural environment more generally. Sludge has these industrial connotations. In fact, the word is sometimes used to refer to industrial waste, industrial sludge. And this is a little bit of a nod towards the fact that, of course, World War One was a deeply mechanized and industrialized conflict. So the sense of the mixture of human remains, waste, what's left over from exploded shells, fragments of metal, and so on, various chemicals being used in war, that forming this sludge. I think that's very, very important. And so individual word choices are really, really key in this poem, and it is something that we need to be attending to. Likewise, there is real creativity around the lexical choices or vocabulary choices that Owen employs. Look at bloodshod, his own construction, his own creation, bloodshod. Now, clearly, there's not much of a leap from bloodshod to blood shed, and the idea of people losing blood, something that obviously would be happening all of the time with people blown up and people being shot, but also the idea that the blood is essentially all that is covering their feet. We might assume that their shoes and so on are kind of degraded, decomposed in the sludge that they're having to trudge their way through. But if you look up the word shod is often used to describe the process of putting metal shoes on horseshoes. And so if we trace, all the way from the beginning of the poem, we've got beggars, then they are hags, and then they're bloodshod, the word shod often being applied to horses and therefore animals. We have this horrible sense of them not only being unmanned, but also fundamentally dehumanized, as if they are these blood-shewed horses trudging their way. They're drunk with fatigue. They've lost their humanity. They are these kind of animals being sent to the slaughter. We also have that sense in there too. Now, I'd like to turn in the second stanza to, well, if we look at the end of the first stanza, the end stop line of gas shells dropping softly behind, the end stop line of that final line of the first stanza, we should pay attention to the way in which then in the next stanza that is suddenly interrupted. They're drunk with fatigue, they're deaf, they've had they're all severely damaged and debilitated physically, and then we get this kind of panicked, intense interruption, gasp, quick boys, that kind of draws them out of their fatigue. It seems to, they eventually sort of hear it. And then again, we go back to diction, an ecstasy of fumbling. Could have used the word frenzy. Why ecstasy? Why not frenzy? An ecstasy of fumbling. I think there's something sort of bitterly ironic about the use of the word ecstasy there. Ecstatic experiences are intense, they are passionate, and they take us outside or beyond ourselves. That's ultimately the etymology of the word. That's where the word has those kind of ideas early on in its life as it enters English. It's also a word drawn from Latin. And I think there's an irony here, a really bleak, grim irony. These young men going to war would imagine that war, in a sense, would be an ecstatic experience, insofar as it would be, kind of enjoyable, sort of almost pleasurable, the sense of military heroism that they could partake in, behaving like kind of real men. And yet that's gone. They're beggars, they're hags, they're bloodshod, like, almost as if they're horses. So the only sort of ecstasy, the only sort of intense ecstatic experience available to them is the experience of having to, in a clumsy, fumbling way, fit their clumsy helmets just in time. So the sense of excitement and potential pleasure and excitement available to them in war, obviously the only enjoyment they have, weird, almost perverse enjoyment, is cheating death on this particular occasion. The end stop line, the comma at the end, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. There is a pause. It's almost, we can take a breath, as in, oh, phew, finally got my helmet on. I've managed to sort of cheat death in this particular moment. And then we've got that word floundering. We come back to diction. We come back then not only to diction, but also I think we can connect that to pathos, the emotional appeal of this poem. And this is a deeply emotive poem. It's going to only become more and more emotive as it proceeds. We've got the sympathy, the deeply sympathetic and indeed pathetic depiction of the soldiers in the first stanza. That second stanza, the man floundering in fire or lime. The word floundering also, I think, connects sort of lexically to the sludge. It reminds us of their sort of clumsy, difficult movement through the sludge that they're cursing their way through, but also obviously brings to mind a fish out of water and the sort of pathetic, gasping movements of such a creature. So the fire line we're going to come back to, or the mention of fire we'll come back to in a moment. Lime is interesting. Of course, lime, this is a chemical substance which is used to speed up the decomposition of bodies. It was bodies that couldn't be buried would be covered in lime, and it would speed up the process of them decomposing on the battlefield. So it was used for that reason. It was also used as a sort of form, I suppose, of disinfectant. There is this horrible idea of the individual who will kind of die and obviously be decomposing, that will kind of return to the soldier, and that idea of things returning and coming back to the soldier is again something that's going to be really, really key that we can explore in a moment. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Now, notice the shift from we turned our backs to I saw him drowning. The process of the poem, the perspective and view of the poem goes, I would say, in some ways from the external, the first stanza being focused on, the kind of the scene, these men bent double, to then the individual soldier, the individual voice that I saw him drowning. Okay, now drowning, this sense of suffocation is deeply unpleasant, connects with the word sea, and this sense of being kind of swamped by, obviously it's a gas attack that is causing this person to die. And then, as if to draw our attention to it even more, in all my dreams before my helpless sight, notice it's all my dreams, all went lame, all blind, that the horror of war is inescapable, it is consuming like fire. It no one is sort of left out of this horror. It consumes all. It is inescapable. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me. Note the tense there. He plunges at me. Okay, the present. He plunges, reliving the experience. Now we would say, and the whole kind of gas attack moment more generally, we would consider this as retelling almost a sort of PTSD type episode. Okay, and I would be looking at making connections between that ongoing sort of repetition of trauma, and then maybe something like the poem "The Manhunt." The unexploded mine buried deep in his mind. That is the trauma of war, which is so sort of buried deep, it's very, very difficult to sort of draw out. But also, the idea within that poem is that you have to be tentative, because anything can set him off. Anything can cause these horrible memories to sort of explode back into life all over again. So Owen, in this third stanza, two-line stanza, separates it, again, drawing our attention to it. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering. Again, think back to pathos, think back to the emotional appeal of this poem and the connection between pathos and the very, very careful word choices or lexical choices that Owen employs. So guttering is a word to describe a flame where the candle is almost sort of not burning properly. So the flame is not sort of continuously lit, but sometimes comes into life and sometimes seems like it's on the cusp of kind of dying, and the candle going out and extinguishing itself because it's not burning properly. So the word guttering, we think candles, we think flames, links us back to the floundering man in a fire. Okay, that idea of burning and being consumed by the gas. I really like the repetition of the word drowning. I think that there's a sort of use of rhetoric there. There's a rhetorical impact of that. Notice we've got drowning, and then two lines later, the word drowning again. The repetition of drowning, rather than finding a rhyme with the word drowning, for me really matters. It's almost like no other word will do. That the only word that can accurately convey the experience, and this is an individual experience, this is seemingly Owen's individual experience, and therefore it lends it a great deal of credibility, but also a great deal of kind of poignancy, and therefore that appeal to pathos. The only word that will do is the word drowning, the sense of being utterly consumed by the gas, being totally unable to breathe, as if one were in water. And then, so we've dealt with ethos, we've dealt with pathos. Now we're on to this final stanza. And this is where I think Owen is demonstrating his control of rhetoric and demonstrating his control of persuasion, because here we've got something that I would understand in terms of logos. So notice the way that two of the lines in the final stanza start with if. Now, this structure, the sort of if this, then this, that actual logical structure is very, very important in rhetoric and in argument. If this is the case, if this happens, then this will be the consequence. And so notice he says, if in some smothering dreams you two could pace, and then within that, it's if you could watch the white eyes writhing in his face, if you could hear. So if you could pace, if you could watch, if you could hear, if you could experience the things that I have experienced, again, credibility, ethos, Owen has gone through these experiences himself. If you could pace, watch, hear, if you could have gone through what I've gone through, then, in effect, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent, and so on. Okay, so you've got that if, then structure. Now that is logos. That is an appeal to logic, that careful logical structuring. If you could experience these things, then you would come to the same conclusion that I would. That is an appeal to logic and reason and rationality, and therefore it's an example of logos. We've got more of the language of drowning and suffocation, as in smothering dreams. The repetition of the word dreams, again, we can think of PTSD itself as a kind of horrible repetition, that the trauma is repeated endlessly on this kind of looping cycle, and that the sufferer, the traumatized individual, can't break that kind of cycle of these horrible memories resurfacing. It's a deeply sort of moving idea. The more that you think about it, I'm very much drawn to the devil's sick of sin. So watch the white eyes writhing in his face. Obviously, writhing in his face got the language of pain and suffering. His hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. So it's a very kind of enigmatic and rather ambiguous line there. So, like a devil's sick of sin, like a devil's face. Is that what it means? But then the devil's face is sick of sin. My interpretation of this, and this is very, very intense, is that what is being seen is so horrifying that it would almost horrify the devil. That the scene being described, the face even being described, is so full of sin. And note the biblical language being alluded to there, that this is what is happening is so disgustingly immoral, is a kind of moral obscenity. It is a sin that it would even disgust. It would make the devil be sick, okay, or feel sick at the extent of the horror that's being witnessed. That's, it's very, very intense stuff. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling forth, obscene as cancer. So again, we've even got the word obscene there I've just used. Bitter as the cud. Now, I'm interested in the word cud. The word cud literally refers to the way that cows digest grass. So they sort of eat grass, they swallow it, it's digested partially, and then they regurgitate it. They pardon me describing it like this, but they kind of vomit it back into their own mouths. They then chew it back over, and then they swallow it, and it's sort of redigested so they can extract as much nutrition from the grass as possible. So on the one hand, the blood coming forth from the lungs as a result of the gas attack is like cud. It's like sort of regurgitated. The blood coming up from the lungs into the throat and mouth is like a cow regurgitating cud. But then also the word cud has lots of associations and links more sort of broadly in English. So to chew the cud is to kind of discuss something with someone, okay, which is kind of interesting, and sort of think things through. And you can see that what is being regurgitated in this poem, if you want to think about it in those terms, what is being vomited back up kind of endlessly is this gas, quick boys, the gas attack, and then these dreams, that every time these traumatic moments reappear, we can think of those as almost psychological regurgitations. Yeah, that they are kind of coming back up from sort of inside Owen's mind, inside the speaker of the poem, to be chewed over again, to be considered, to be thought about, to be horribly replayed, as I say, in this sort of endless cycle. So again, it's a deeply unpleasant image. It's a disgusting, gross image. In many ways, it's an example of Wilfred Owen's mastery, really, of diction, and therefore his ability to make these very powerful emotional appeals to us. It's designed to produce revulsion and obviously make us consider the sort of the brutal realities of war, the true horrors of war. It's very difficult to read this and think about, as bitter as the cud, the blood gargling in the froth corrupted lungs. Very difficult to then link that with the idea that it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The other word that I would be particularly interested in is the word ardent. Most of the words in this poem are resolutely Anglo-Saxon or Old English. They're sort of Germanic in origin. And we tend to associate words that are Germanic in origin, that are Anglo-Saxon in origin. They tend to feel more everyday, more kind of ordinary, more visceral, whereas words that tend to come from Latin and Greek feel, I suppose, more rarefied, feel more academic, feel more intellectual. So most of the language in this poem, the words being used, they tend to come from Anglo-Saxon sources, but ardent, as well as ecstasy, and there are a couple of other examples, certainly ardent is Latin. Now, the word ardent originally means kind of like burning, being sort of consumed by burning, being consumed by fire. Over time, the word has shifted meaning. You'll potentially come across very soon in your study of Macbeth the idea of burning with passion, burning with desire, and that's the general meaning of the word. Now, if you are sort of desperate, if you are full of desire, you're full of passion for someone or something, then you are ardent. But the word originally means kind of literally being consumed by fire, being burning or being on fire. I think that matters as well because the word ardent links back to the man in fire in that second stanza. So these young men, and in fact, actually, they're children. Yeah, so think about the connotations of innocence and vulnerability there. They're beggars, they're hags, bloodshod. We're thinking horses, vulnerable animals, and then by the end, it's to children. So emphasizing their youth, their inexperience, their vulnerability. They're ardent for some desperate glory. So they burned with desire for the kind of potential glory of war, the sort of the ecstasy of heroism in war, if you will. And what have they actually got in reality? The reality is they're not, the only burning going on is the sort of literal burning of their lungs as they breathe in gas, and slowly their lungs fill with blood and they sort of cough their last, and it's this horrible, traumatic, writhing, disgusting, obscene death. Okay, so I think that's very, very important there. That the use of the word ardent and its etymological connections to burning harks back to, ironically, the man in fire or lime, and that sense of being consumed by the gas. It's a horrible image and shows again, ironically, the realities of war they don't match up with what these men were promised, which is heroism, glory. That it's sweet and fitting, even if you do die, it's going to be sweet and fitting, your end. And that's what makes it a lie. And notice that lie is capitalized, almost as if it's an archetype. Now, the actual phrase "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori" obviously is from the Roman poet Horace. It was used a lot in the 19th century and was used in war propaganda in and around World War One, and that's why Wilfred Owen sort of alights upon it, that this aphorism, this sort of little saying from Horace, was used as part of the sort of broader war propaganda effort and had been used throughout the 19th century to justify, kind of the colonial expansion of our empire and colonial violence. But it's a lie. It's a lie. It's not true. Now, it's kind of ambiguous. Is Owen suggesting that dying in any war is not sweet and fitting, that it's never sweet and fitting to die for one's country? I'm not quite sure he is suggesting that. I do think that quite specifically that this is a poem rhetorically aimed at those who, as he says, my friend, people perhaps like Jesse Pope, and Who's for the Game, who were presenting war as a game, as an opportunity for glory, that made these children, these young men, ardent for that glory, desperate for that glory. The truth is that it's a lie. The only burning going on is the burning of one's lungs as you inhale gas. There's nothing. If you were desperate for glory, the only thing that's desperate is your, debilitated physical and psychological state. Okay, so just to reiterate, a really useful way of thinking about this poem is in terms of the Aristotelian triad. We've got his credibility. He's a deeply credible poet on this topic because he lived through it. Okay, he experienced it. He did actually die in war. Okay, he died about a week before the end of the First World War in 1918. He died just before the war ended. His parents and relatives would have, got the official news of his death essentially as people were celebrating the end of the First World War. You can only imagine what that would have been like from their perspective. Okay, so this is a deeply credible poet writing emotively, okay, so relentlessly through very specific word choices, appealing to our emotions. So we've got pathos, but also using some rhetorical structures that we associate with classical rhetoric. So the sort of if, then structure that Owen employs in the final stanza. So I hope that that's been useful in getting you to maybe think about this poem in some new and different ways, and how you might seek to compare this poem to perhaps something like The Manhunt, and the way in which that poem looks at almost how easy it is to trigger the dreams, the PTSD style sort of flashbacks, so these episodes, the way in which these psychological traumas can re-emerge. Obviously, in this poem, in Dulce et Decorum Est, there's a horrible sense of almost psychological regurgitation going on. But I think there's a connection there, isn't there? And interesting in The Manhunt, the different perspective, the perspective of the partner, the wife, recognizing that it's so easy to trigger these sorts of horrible moments, these horrible repetitions, and therefore having to engage in such sort of tentative help and support, just being so kind of cautious and ginger with one's partner, with one's spouse who's been traumatized with war. It also is a reminder, of course, that the traumas of war don't end when the final bullet has been shot, but that they last and they are sort of endlessly repeated. That the trauma of war, unfortunately, doesn't end with the war itself, but lasts for a very, very long time after, indeed, in those endless, horrible psychological repetitions. So I hope that this has been a useful podcast for you, and just giving you some different ideas, different ways of approaching this poem, so that when it does come to the end of year exam, you feel like you've got some interesting points of analysis and interesting points of comparison between this poem and any of the other poems in the selection that you've studied. Anyway, as always, I hope you found that useful, and thank you so much for listening.